This week's Piltch Point with Avram Piltch is proudly powered by PureVPN. The best way to protect your privacy online is with PureVPN. You can hide your online activities, say goodbye to regional restrictions, and improve your streaming quality. Plus, it's available for almost all of your devices, and you can get a special price and a 31-day money-back guarantee right now by going to piltchpoint.live/PureVPN. Oh, your drumming made me laugh. I wasn't prepared for that. All right. So, it is literally the last day of Techtober. And this week brought us another product announcement.
Yes. So, also this week, by the way, I should mention that I think there was we also had we also had some information about Intel stuff this week. But let's talk about the important announcement from Thursday. This is the new Raspberry Pi 02W single board computer. So for those of you who have not been watching our show religiously, and why haven't you been? You might not know that Raspberry Pi is a huge phenomenon with over 40 million of these boards sold, of Raspberry Pi boards sold in the last 9+ years that Raspberry Pi has been out. There are many models of Raspberry Pi, and this is the latest one. So previously there was the Raspberry Pi 0 and 0W, which came out, I think the 0W was 2017. And those looked identical to this physically, same ports, every layout, everything, but they were a mere single core processor with 512 megabytes of RAM. So the 02W upgrades the processor to quad-core ARM Cortex-A53. So that makes it significantly faster than the old 0. Now, why would you want a 0 as opposed to a more full-size Raspberry Pi like the one that I have in this case here? Try to dig out a bare Raspberry Pi, but I don't seem to have one within arm's reach at the moment. Well, it fits into a lot more spaces. It's less expensive. This is going now for $15. It has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, although only 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, 802.11n, not 802.11ac or the new Wi-Fi 6. But you can do quite a bit with this. The original 0 worked for doing some game emulation. You could use it. You could build your own sort of Game Boy style console with it. This can emulate more significant games. So where the previous one, maybe it could do a little bit, a little bit of emulation of older stuff. This can actually do, I think, like the equivalent of a PlayStation 1 emulation, where the previous model could not at all do machine learning. This can do object recognition at a frame rate of about 1.75 frames a second. So if you're pointing it at faces or objects or whatever, you can use it for that. So it is a noteworthy upgrade. It is still 512 megabytes of RAM, unfortunately, because the RAM and the processor are all one unit, so one on top of the other. So they couldn't easily get more RAM into the upgrade. Other than that, what you have here is what you've had on the prior model, on the 0 and 0W. And the difference, by the way, is that the 0 has no Wi-Fi and costs $5. The 0W has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth that costs $10. And then this is the 02W that's $15. And no, there's no 02 without Wi-Fi, but they wanted to be consistent. So in the naming. So what you have here is two micro USB ports, one of which is for power only and one of which is for data. You have mini HDMI out for your video. You data is stored on the micro SD card slot here. That's what you boot off of. Obviously, you can run Raspberry Pi OS on this, which is Raspberry Pi's version of Debian Linux, but you can also run many other operating systems like versions of Ubuntu. And over here, they don't come pre-soldered, but you can solder them, are the 40 GPIO pins, which allow you to, once you put solder pins into them, use it to attach an entire huge ecosystem of Raspberry Pi hats, which are called, HAT stands for hardware attached on top. And you can use it for things like lights, motors, sensors, RGB screens, LED matrices, all kinds of fun stuff off of this little computer, which is significantly smaller and cheaper than a regular Raspberry Pi, which the base model, which we discussed last week, the Raspberry Pi 4 1 gigabyte, goes for $35. So this is $20 cheaper than that. It's about a third of the size, and it also uses significantly less power in that, where that is maybe using, maybe it's using, close to an amp just to idle. This here will do, I'm looking at our power consumption numbers. It has very, very low power consumption. So at idle, this will do about 250 milliamps, and under extreme stress, like running a Strasberry, which is like, which is just basically maxing it out, it will use 580 milliamps. So very, very low power. You can power this very easily off of a USB port from your laptop. So what would you do with this? You could use it to build robots. You could use it to build an AI security camera. You can attach an official Raspberry Pi camera to the camera slot right here. You can use it for game emulation. You can use it as a little tiny computer for web surfing, although with 512 megabytes of RAM, it's not great as a desktop. But you can do that if you want to. Also, you can overclock this. We found it was really easy to get this up to 1.4 from the 1 gigahertz stock speed up to 1.4 gigahertz with just a cheap heatsink on it. So very easy for you to get a little bit of extra performance out of the Raspberry Pi 02W, which should be available a lot of places now for $15.
Wow, that's a decent upgrade for a $5 change in price. It is a shame that the Wi-Fi is only 2.4N though.
Yeah, they haven't. I mean, to really keep it simple and keep it. I mean, this is the Raspberry Pi Zero line is extremely popular among Raspberry Pi people among Raspberry Pi fans, because it's so inexpensive and low power and small. So it's easier to throw into products like robots. Of course, with the advent of the Raspberry Pi Pico, some of the things that people were using Zero for, they're now using Pico for, because if they just needed it to be a microcontroller, the Pico is $4 and it has analog to digital functionality. So it's good for it's a good replacement for for an Arduino or something like that. But this is but the Zero 2W, just like the Zero before it, is a full-fledged Linux PC. I have somewhere off behind me a Game Boy like case for Pi Zero. You stick it in there and it basically turns and gives you you run whatever emulators you want on it, and it will run Game Boy games or whatever emulation you want. But there's performance limitations. If I stuck this in the same case, I would probably I'd be able to emulate something like a PS1 or better stuff. Of course, if you move up to Raspberry Pi 4, you're going to get even better emulation, the ability to at least do a Nintendo 64, and you are going to get better performance from AI. You're going to get something like maybe 3 or 4 frames per second of image recognition instead of 1.75. But the cost, the size, low power requirements, low heat make this good for a lot of projects. What one year I did for my staff was I went and I got everybody Raspberry Pi Zero Ws as like holiday presents, and I just went and I put like a micro SD card with like a little holiday greeting on it, and then I gave them each their like virtual card on it, and then but the trick was, in order to see my greeting, they had to actually like boot it up and try it. So, and that was a very affordable set of holiday gifts for me, particularly because at one point Micro Center was selling the Zero W for $5, so which is the same price as the Zero non-W. So that that's a good. It's definitely a less expensive sort of starter Pi for people than the original Pi, which is $35 now. As we discussed last week, you used to get 2 gigabytes for $35. The price went up to $45 for 2 gigabytes, but you can still get the 1 gigabyte Pi for $35. By the way, just to follow up on our discussion from last week, we had a episode of the PiCast show, which is another show that I host, which is only about Raspberry Pi, on Thursday to talk about this new announcement. And we had Raspberry Pi founder and CEO Evan Upton on, and we asked him about the price increases, and he told us he does not expect the price of anything else to increase.
Okay, that's good, because we had that conversation last week. Do we think anything else is going to get hit by this? So.
Yes. So we got to talk to the leading authority on whether it will, and he said he does not expect it. So
that's good.
And he also said he expects to be able to fulfill orders. He expects to
even more.
He doesn't expect major shortages of anything, although they are going to concentrate more on delivering Pi 4s and delivering last generation Pi 3s, which they still make. So people may have problems getting old fashioned Pi 3s. Gotcha. If they want to buy a new Pi 3 today, which as a company, they almost never stop end of life things. They have a lot of industrial clients who buy these sorts of things and pop them into products that they're making. So they don't want to leave those companies out in the lurch. So they will continue making, like they still make the Raspberry Pi 2. They still make the Raspberry Pi A plus and B plus. There's no good reason for a normal person to buy that stuff because it's not cheaper. So if you're buying a Raspberry Pi, there's no reason to buy a 3 instead of a 4. Right? The 4 is more powerful and it costs the same amount. But in this case, the Pi Zero W is going to continue to be $10, and this is going to continue to be $15. So there's an argument there about if you don't need the quad core, you could save $5. But I think the key message there is that they are going to be able to continue to continue to make, continue to really deliver with the huge demand that is out there for these products. Some folks have already gotten their 02s, and I saw a project just today where somebody took their 02W and they are using it as a YouTube subscriber counter. They have it set up with like a 7-segment display, just showing how many YouTube subscribers they have at any given moment. And again, that's a good use of something. I mean, granted, for that they probably could have gotten away with the original 0W, but
most certainly.
But that's a good use of a 0 series because you're not using that much power, so you're not wasting a ton of electricity just leaving it there. And it's small, and you can put it in a compact little box. So anyway, these are out. Definitely a great addition to the Raspberry Pi lineup. And as always, I say, if you don't have a Raspberry Pi, you should get one. This is not a bad first Raspberry Pi for someone, although my recommendation is probably to go for the $35 Raspberry Pi 4, 1 gigabyte, and to get it in a kit that comes with other accessories that you might want to use with it.
Gotcha. And I imagine you've got all kinds of more information on this.
We have a review. We have an overclocking guide. We have some other stories about it, and we're working on even some more. So definitely check it out at tomshardware.com.
Fantastic. Well, as always, Avram, I always appreciate you bringing these things. I had heard about this, partially because obviously I follow Tom's Hardware, but I'd heard about it elsewhere, but I didn't have a ton of details on it. So I always appreciate it, and I look forward to what we talk about next. Hello, YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Piltch Point with Avram Piltch. If you did, please subscribe to our channel, and of course hit the notification bell, since subscriptions don't mean much on YouTube anymore. And if you've got topics you'd like us to discuss in the future, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. If you don't want to follow us on YouTube, that's okay. There's a lot of other ways that you can follow our content. You can find all of that by going to plughitslive.com/subscribe. There you'll see all of our shows and all the different ways that you can watch, listen, and follow along.